Question to start with, and maybe I have a couple, but maybe that will encourage our panelists to speak with one another. And so I thought, Stuart, I would start with you. And I was just wondering, can you identify in a recent Chicago tall building, built or proposed, that offers opportunities for the skyscraper urbanism that you described? And I'm thinking, Wolf Point perhaps is one that comes to mind.
Actually, the building that I think works urbanistically at two different scales is also a building that I absolutely hate architecturally. I think it's kind of a not so wonderful building, but it makes the right moves, and it's the Associates Tower. I mean, I think chamfering the top of the building as a recognition of the corner and the diagonal into the park is the right thing to do. I think the chamfer destroys the building, is overscaled, and is kind of stupid, but I'm sorry. Oh, I'm a member of the AIA. I'm not supposed to say that about other people's work. The other thing that I think works at the Associates building is the way in which the corner is handled at the ground floor, which again is a kind of something we can identify as a period piece, because I don't think people chamfer and use angles to direct people in the same way. But in fact, the mass of the building comes down, and then the building and entrance to the building and shopfront work below is manipulated in a way that you can, in fact, understand the corner as a special condition without, in fact, doing, I guess, well, I sort of like the corner of Carson Perry Scott, but, I mean, it doesn't do that. It doesn't recognize the corner as a kind of primary deformation of the building, but it all happens within the volume of the building at the ground level.
Anybody want to comment?
I was going to say, I actually think the Trump building is quite a good building. On a scale, it's a gigantic scale, and I think it's very difficult to pull off a building of that size and have it work. I think there's flaws with it. I think it's base a little heavy, but I think its position on the river, on Wabash, and particularly on the skyline is actually quite nice. And I look at how there's many glass towers in this town. That particular one does have a sparkling element to it, and it's constantly changing. So I think it actually fulfills some of the objectives of, let's say, glass architecture in a way that actually few buildings do.
Thank you. Robert, Adam, I had a question for you as well. Just wondering, do you expect the reemergence of a nationalistic architecture as a response to current globalized nature of the place in which we live?
Possibly. I mean, the basic premise is that architecture tends to follow, both in terms of time. I mean, it's a slow process, architecture. It takes a long time to educate architects. They get stuck with their ideas for a very long time. You can't really design a building until you're quite old. It takes a long time to build them. So when you're looking for what's changing in the social, political, and economic field, you need to look at the social, political, and economic field. And we know that's changing. We're in the second great period of globalization. We know that a lot of nation states are breaking up. We know that there's a lot of identity politics has become a very important issue. As I say, Catalonia just voted to become independent. It won't. Scotland nearly did. Czechoslovakia broke up. The Russian Empire has broken up. This is going on and on. So, in theory, if these things are a sort of genuine, I mean, we know they're a genuine reason because they're actually happening, then one would expect some sort of architectural response. As to whether there is or not, I don't know. The problem with being in the middle of something is you don't know it's happening. And it may come in a very surprising way. Certainly, if you look historically, the correspondence, when you're looking back on it, between social, political, and economic events and architecture is remarkable. So I would expect it. And, maybe it is lie in the much despised field of traditional architecture. Maybe it's not. I am beginning to detect in the UK, and I don't know if this is true elsewhere, a much less harsh division between people's view of traditional architecture and let's call it contemporary or modernist architecture. This has really happened in about the last 5 years in schools of architecture, because I think that anyone who finished their training after about 1995 has never seen traditional architecture as any kind of threat, because postmodernism died in about 1990. So actually, there's no real threat. So somehow this thing just becomes a curiosity, and out of curiosity comes interest. But I may be reading the runes incorrectly, because it's very difficult to tell, but I'm definitely detecting this at this particular moment. Everyone needs to just keep their eyes open. But if the basic premise is right, which I believe it is, that architecture and urban design follow, they don't lead, politics, economics, and social change, if the interpretation of politics, economics, social change is correct, which I think it demonstrably is, we will expect an architectural response.
I wonder if anybody has any thing to say about whether or not Chicago's, if Chicago's in that, do we see that going on here? Same sort of question, but as it applies to Chicago. Any thoughts?
I could answer that. Chicago was made relatively recently, and it was made by people who were building buildings for profit. And so a lot of these kind of concerns about traditional versus modern, I don't think that's the issue here. I mean, I think what was happening in Chicago is that there were people building businesses, and they were using architecture to advertise their businesses, and the architects were competing to get that work. And there were influences coming from New York, which New York looks quite different. It's quite a different kind of architecture. And people like Sullivan and Burnham had their own sort of agenda and what they wanted. And the Chicago plan isn't so innocent as it looks. Burnham was actually making commissions for himself. I mean, he wanted to do the city hall, of course, and he wanted to do the museum where the fountain is now. And that was blocked by partisan politics within merchants. That Montgomery Ward blocked Marshall Field from building the museum in the middle, and people spend a lot of money protecting their own kind of interests. This has nothing to do with style. It actually has to do with the thing why Chicago architecture was vital at the time was it was an incredibly close link between life and art. And they actually touched each other at that moment. The way we talk about it now, it's like it's a museum show. We have traditionalism, we have modernism. I just don't get it. I think that's not the issue. I think the issue is, how do you actually build buildings which represent sort of the ethos of not the place, the ethos of the place. What are the people actually trying to do? And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And I don't think people trained to be architects think about that much. I don't think you're taught to think like that. And I think that's a problem. I think architecture as a culture is problematic. And we all sit here and, we've competed for things. And in the end, we sort of know how it all works, but nobody's really going to tell anybody. So, I mean, I think it's a very basic battle over culture that occurs, and money is the main vehicle, and architects somehow are in the middle of all that. And that's actually what made Chicago. It's not the battleground of the spirit, it's the battleground of egos and money. And the spirit, the people, the working class in Chicago are unrepresented in a way. At the time of the World's Fair, they built these amazing pavilions, this amazing urban vision of what a city might be like. And the population was living in wood shacks. And the visitors to the World's Fair were horrified by what they saw in Chicago in the slums here. And, you know, I think that the whole proposition here, the architecture in a certain way is superlative. The social aspects of it are not superlative. I mean, I think we could fix that by being more interested in neighborhoods and what happens there. Whether it has to do with place, I'm not sure. I think we ought to protect what we have, which is built. The neighborhoods are full of kind of beautiful stuff, which could be expanded on and saved, or you could build new things. I mean, how can you build a city with no new things? I mean, what would happen to Wrigleyville if you hadn't built Wrigley Field? I mean, Wrigley Field is a totally went off. It made the whole area. Somebody has to sometime do something new. You can't block all those possibilities of what might happen. So I think over-management of the city, sort of aesthetically, I think is probably not a great idea.
Well, of course, the irony is that that will be a political decision, and the over-management of a city will be what you do politically. I mean, so ironically, that different cultures manage things differently. So, I mean, for some European cultures, things are managed to death.
Yes.
And odd enough, of course, that is a political decision which has its implications in architecture and urban design.
Yes.
These things, it's rather like you were saying of Chicago when it was built, responded to business. That, in fact, was an economic factor, and that was very clearly reflected. So the irony is that it doesn't matter what you do, you are reflecting your political and economic circumstances.
Yeah, it would be nice. My point is, it would be nice if architects actually owned up to what was going on. The slide that showed what architects do and what they say, I thought that was quite brilliant, actually, because that's one of the problems. There's kind of duplicity built into the profession, which isn't good. That's why discussing these things becomes very difficult, because people have one face where they're promoting themselves, and another face where they're saying what they should be going on. I think that you could correct that. I think it could be corrected in the schools. First of all, if you actually change the way people thought about architecture. The move towards marketing as the answer for architecture, I think, is a very bad move. I mean, marketing is the whole thing now. And I think that's not good, personally.
Mark, I wondered if you might have want to speculate on the next steps in the evolution of the curtain wall.
Lots of things are possible. What we're looking at is higher thermal performance and more exacting construction. I mean, generally what we find now is enclosure systems for millennia have been done on site, and what we're finding is that's no longer the case. They're all done in a very controlled environment where it's the skill and the materials put in are no longer left to chance. They're quite controlled. They're tested. So we see skin as something that has evolved from a technology standpoint that allows much more performance, much more, I think, reliability, and ultimately predictability from a cost and a construction standpoint. What we continue to struggle with is how can we get more of the building to have those components of performance that we can actually get with skins these days.
It's interesting. It's one of the high priests of the glass curtain wall in Britain was Foster's, and Ken Shuttleworth, who was responsible for a lot of these, has now declared that the curtain wall is finished because under British thermal regulations, it's almost impossible to build them. Of course, one can keep on technologically trying to advance it, but it gets more and more difficult. we commissioned a test from Atelier 10, I think Atelier 10, well-known firm, where we did 2 theoretical buildings. They were identical in every respect, in orientation and plan and size. And one of them had 2 glass curtain walls in it. One of them had 2, let's call them dense walls with holes in them, that's called windows. And we tested these, Atelier 10 tested them for commercial and domestic use. And they got the the curtain wall to triple glazed, argon filled, and solar protected. And in every condition, it was outperformed by double glazed, dense wall construction. And even they were surprised by that. Now, that's not to say that we can't carry on technologically improving curtain walls. If people want to have curtain walls, they'll keep on doing it because that's what technology does. But it just gets more and more difficult when actually it's easier not to have them. But that's broadly speaking. And interestingly, the architectural response to this, and I'm not talking about traditional architectural response to this, there's a very interesting architectural response to this, was because the glass curtain wall was a default material, a lot of people simply lost the skills of building, of what to do with all this solid wall. In Britain now, I mean, the brick market must have gone completely crazy because every external wall is now brick. I mean, it's sort of painted on brick. It has no structural logic to it at all. And when it's any other material, there's a huge development in making cubic forms, et cetera, out of this. But interestingly, this is a response to thermal regulations in Britain, which is a moderate climate. I mean, it never has extremes. It's just becoming extremely difficult. But the next thing that's happening, though, and I say to contradict what I've said, is the next thing that's happening is windows that are capable of generating electricity. That's the next move that's coming up. And this may be the thing that rescues the curtain wall from thermal regulations.
Okay. I wondered, I have one last question, and then we can open this up to audience members. I wondered, Bob Somel, if you might expand a little bit on the idea that the Chicago Architecture Biennial shouldn't be about Chicago. Here you go.
Well, it's too late now. Let me go back because I think I want to address that question through this issue which has been coming up, which is sort of the political agency of architecture, which I think is a little bit surprising given what we've been talking about. But I think, following up on Tom's, correct diagnosis of architectural rhetoric being reduced to forms of advertising and marketing, which I think is what I was also trying to say. Though I want to be clear, I think when architects say the new Vitruvian triad, sustainable, equitable, and beautiful, they are saying marketing slogans. They're actually not saying a political slogan, because that's what you're forced and compelled to say. And once you're forced to say something, that's no longer a political speech, that's just a requirement. And so I think to be political, we have to have the possibility of saying things other and different. And that's the kind of architecture, as a cultural project, I also want to inhabit. And so I think we don't need more of the same. And in terms of being, let's say, not about place, I think, my question to Mark and to Tom and to Stuart to some extent was really, in a way, I think the place, Chicago, any place, the site, the context, provides the material that you use, or maybe the occasion or the conceit or the excuse for what you do. But it seems to me it doesn't actually produce the project for what you do. And I think that architects always have to keep a double set of books. And I don't think you can excuse away what you do by saying the context made me do it, or Chicago made me do it, or the site made me do it. I think that you have to take a stand and say, I want a different kind of world, or I want this kind of world, and cop to it, and not say it's the client likes this, and I want to accommodate the client, or this place made me do it because it looks like this. I mean, it looks like anything we want it to look like. We have a much greater latitude in terms of what we can do and reframe as a political architecture. And so my question to the architects is, what architects do you look to? Because clearly you look to other architects, not just to the past, and you're in a dialogue and conversation with them. And so one assumes that at the time of the Harold Washington one is thinking of Portland and AT&T, or when you're looking at Spertus, there's a whole history of origami folded facades. It is a 10-year area of research. So it's not just an accident of context, it's actually a disciplinary issue that you're having with other colleagues around the world, not just in Chicago.
So one of the questions is if, and I should say I admire Spertus a lot, but as a response to its context, in spite of the fact that Mark talks about maintaining the wall of Michigan Avenue, in fact, the idea that you would fold or make a three-dimensional volume that sits between adjacent buildings, or a curtain wall that suggests that it's a portion of a three-dimensional volume, I think is antithetical to an understanding of what those buildings do collaboratively in terms of making a street wall. So the whole idea that contextualism is somehow this decision to make something that just looks like what's there, or just is urbanistically continuing what's there, is a kind of misunderstanding. And I think you have to go back to the idea that every time you build a building, it's part of a context. Even if you're building it on a hillside or in a pasture, it is somehow, it constitutes in the choices that you make about it a value judgment about the environment it's set in. And if the environment that new building is set in is in a city or within the area of existing buildings, then one of the ways in which to read that building is as a value judgment about the adjacent buildings. And I think the legacy of that idea is that modernism set out to create a utopian, socialist utopian world that was categorically different from all of the buildings that existed at that point in time or existed around the new structure, so that those buildings, in insisting upon the fact that they were physically detached and visually separate from existing buildings, were in fact passing a negative value judgment on the adjacent context. So that idea, at least for me, makes the idea of context not as the governing principle in the first decisions you make in design, but one of the careful choices that you need to make, because whether you intend it or not, the buildings you build will in fact have a relationship, either negative or positive, to where you build them.
I think very interesting response, actually, not yours, actually, Stuart, previous one. But that was very interesting, so it wasn't interesting. Okay. Sorry, I didn't say it wasn't interesting. I'm responding to the first response. I'm sorry, that's already been said. And it wasn't really insulting you.
I could always change my middle name to Bob.
No, I could
that Bob.
I could then call you. I then call you Bob too. That'd be all right. Everyone have to shift on. But the interesting thing is, two statements actually, architects responding to architects, and you can do anything you want. I suppose in society you can do anything you want, you can shoot people, but they tend to lock you up for a long time. And it's very interesting how, actually, I'm very self-referential that the discussion about architects is. That architects talking to architects about architecture. The curious thing is, actually, what about people? What about people who aren't architects, who don't understand what architects do and say? Because actually, they're the people that occupy, live in, walk past, identify with, or try and identify with it. And I mean, for my sins, one of the things I do is I design what we call in Britain, I don't even call it the same thing, speculative housing. That is housing produced for sale to unknown purchasers. And I'm constantly berated by my fellow professionals for this, because A, they think it's a really shit thing to be doing, and that somehow I'm betraying my architectural thing. But because they like the speculative houses, they don't do a very good job, but they do employ me. One of the reasons they employ me is that survey after survey after survey in Britain demonstrates that about 85% of the public want to buy something that looks traditional. And I'm constantly told this is nonsense. I should be listening to what architects do, and I should really be educating people to think like architects, because this would make them better, of course. No one ever thought it might be the other way around. I put up a simple commercial proposition to them. If you're investing millions and millions of pounds, dollars, whatever particular currency, yuan, and you're doing it at risk, And you're doing it at risk. You know that about 80% of your unknown purchasers want one thing, or 85%. You know about 15% might want something else. I mean, it's a no-brainer. I mean, I wouldn't risk millions of dollars on the 15%. I'd go for the 85%, personally. Now, that may be, you know, selling myself down the market. That may be something. But actually, I believe my job is to do a good job of what people want, not what architects want. And as a result of that, a lot of architects don't like me, but architects don't pay me, as it happens. Clients pay me. The commercial world is different, because the commercial, and for that matter, the civic world are different, because you deal with committees, you deal with corporations, you deal with people who are often advised by architects, or advised by civil servants who relate to architects. But the real nitty-gritty is ordinary people who have to go out there and spend a lot of their money on buying something they want to call home. Of course, civic movements, actually throughout the world, civic movements are often occupied by ordinary people who try and express this kind of thing. So, as I say, it's interesting. When you get a group of architects together, they want to talk to other architects and about other architects. But I would suggest, and it's a citywide issue, actually you might talk to people, because it's people that occupy places.
Kim, if I might share one little anecdote, and I don't mean to beat up on Renzo Piano. I have a lot of respect for his skills, but there's an amusing story relevant to this issue of how architects, their attitude toward other architects, or their attitude toward the place where they're building. There was an interview with Piano in San Francisco after his California Institute of Science and Technology opened, which happens to be immediately across a classical esplanade in Golden Gate Park from the new Herzog and de Meuron de Young Museum. And a non-architect journalist from the Chronicle asked Mr. Piano, well, I'm curious to know, you know, your new building is immediately across this classical esplanade, this very formalized axial alley, from this other building, contemporary building by Herzog and de Meuron, your friends from Switzerland. And there doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between your building and theirs, even though you're staring at each other across this formal public space. How do you account for the fact that there is no relationship? And Piano answered, why should there be a relationship? They were being them, and I was being me. And I just think that it would be very interesting to think about the consequences for urbanism of an attitude where each architect is sort of being him or her. I guess we should recognize diversity here. That somehow or other the notion that we can just sort of be ourselves is nice. I suppose if we are talking about art museums, I think it gets a little more difficult if we're talking about housing and schools and other kinds of buildings. But I'm very concerned about that, because I don't think that Daniel Burnham and Atwood and the other people we've been talking about would have expressed themselves in that way.
Well, we don't have to speculate about all of this. I mean, there are places like that, like, Houston, for instance, parts of New York that have been rebuilt. We can actually go experience those things and make determinations about what we value in our civic or physical environment.
Can I just say one thing? I think if you're offered the kind of choice between people designing what they want versus someone telling you what to do, I would have to fall on the side of having people do what they want, because I think the idea of legislating ordinances that tell you how to design things is odious, personally. And I think that places like that, in the end, are self-defeating, because the work just builds on itself in an ever more mediocre way. If you look at the way architecture works, the success of Mies, or the success of classicism earlier, it's always the forces of the marketplace someone's always trying to figure out how to do it cheaper. And so that the quality of any manner of building over time has a tendency to devolve rather than evolve. And I'm concerned about having some bureaucracy register what's supposed to happen. I think that's not good.
We do,
Well,
have,
of course.
we do have that in the UK, as you know, and it tends to produce what's called the lowest common denominator. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There's a tendency to do that. I always do believe that if you actually end up, if you want to have things you really like, you probably have to put up with things you really don't like. I mean, that's just the nature of it. I still think that the problem lies in the disconnect between, let's say, what people want is always a very difficult thing to put, and what architects want to produce. The truth of the matter is that I believe if there is any moral duty in these things, it's if people want things, it's to give it to them in roughly in the form they would like, but just do it very well, and it's possible.
Yeah,
And this is a perfectly reasonable and possible thing to do.
That's true.
Bureaucracies are initially destructive, but it's not necessarily. You can structure these democracies so
But bureaucracy is not the people. The bureaucracy is someone speaking for the people on their behalf, right?
Well,
it's an
Tom,
aspect
let me just clarify that I've never suggested that there should be, well, we heard earlier about the Mies Police, which I hadn't heard about before. I was
Well, that's,
charmed
but
to
that's
hear
within one building.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is I've never suggested there should be a coercive thing. Nobody told you what to do when you were designing the library. You did it that way because you understood that that was the way you ought to do it. I suspect you were aspiring to a certain kind of a cultural plane, a certain kind of cultural community that you wanted to reflect in the building with your collaborators. I think that's a perfect example of what I would be in favor of, not any kind of dictatorial thing.
That was entirely voluntary. It was
Well,
also
that's what I'm in favor of.
design
I'm in favor of
build.
voluntary
It was
quality.
design-build competitions, so we had control of it, because we were building it with our money. We could build what we wanted. And so the team actually had an agreement of what they wanted to do, and that worked fine. But I'm not sure that's going to work everywhere.
You know, obviously, everyone here would find it odious to have the style and the characteristics of building they're doing dictated to them. The interesting history and the interesting recent model of that would be the new urbanism. And I remember, we were actually one of the first people to build at Seaside when it was, you know, maybe 20 or so houses. And I remember having a discussion with Andreas Duani about the whole idea of a physical code. And what he pointed out to me, and I think he was probably as surprised as anyone, that there was a kind of uniformity of architectural style to Seaside, because the code itself simply says things like all the houses should be set back or should be this far from the property line. All the ridge lines should be this high, except if you have a viewing platform or a walkable deck for a roof. All the front porches should have eaves at this height, but only if you build a front porch. Nobody says you have to build a front porch.
There's detailed things like the rafters had to be exposed, and you had to have white oyster shell walks. And
I mean, I have to say, I write.
I don't think those were part of. I don't think those were part of the original code. I think that is actually something that happened with the Seaside architects and with Robert Davis, and I have in fact had that discussion with Andreas, and I think it was his intention to control the scale and the urbanism and the character of the streets rather than the character of the architecture. On the other hand, I find it fascinating that individual architects, after a few houses had been built, bought into the idea that there was something intrinsically appealing about having all this trellising and if you will, almost a Disneyland quality of scale and Victoriana.
I tell you that I want two things. I just want to comment on the point about bureaucracy. Is every large-scale democracy has a bureaucracy. You just have to. It's just practical. How far, what powers you give it, what it does, another matter altogether.
But what do they control?
Oh, no, exactly. What powers they give it is another matter altogether. The truth of the matter is that in the UK, actually, style is very frequently dictated by bureaucracies, and they have swung from sort of general conservation to modernism, interesting enough. I'm told to do things that are of their time now as a stylistic direction. Usually the committees don't permit it, but the bureaucrats do. But on the codes issue, it is perfectly possible, and I do it because we write lots of codes. I write codes for the Prince of Wales where the codes actually say what the building's going to look like stylistically. I also write codes which have no style. They just say height, position of building, general urban control, and no one is allowed to comment on the style of the architecture. All we do is to control the relationship between the buildings and their public face, and sometimes a reasonable level of consistency, like window-to-wall ratio or something like that. And it's perfectly possible, and it's perfectly reasonable, because but interestingly, you get two kinds of architects who respond to this. When I wrote the first of these, I went to the leading award-winning architects who's in Edinburgh and said, could you build a building to these codes that was good? And to a man, and there was men as it happens, as a man they wrote back and said, yes, not only can we do this, but we think this is how all architecture should be controlled. Then they had other architects, who interestingly enough were often lesser architects, who said, codes get in the way of my creative ability. My only interest is tearing them up. Well, that's fine, you don't get a job to build in this area. All architects work within restrictions. And the first thing you try and do is find out what the restrictions are. You know, the program's usually the first one, and the budget's usually the second one. All you're doing is you're just adding a level of what I call
Those
civic
are zoning, those are actually zoning, not visual characteristic coding, right?
Yeah. Well, the coding I'm talking about has got a visual aspect to it. Height is a visual aspect. Relationship to the back of the sidewalk is a visual aspect, but it's not stylistic.
You know,
which is done here. The notion of what scale a building can be, how it might step back, you know, what the conditions are in not so much in Chicago, but certainly in New York, the setback parameters for buildings from street wall to particular point as it rises is very prescriptive, certainly much more than it is in Chicago.
You know, codes are a relatively new idea. The first zoning codes in this country dated from the 20s. They're based on English nuisance law, which says you can't build a tannery next to my house. But prior to the existence of codes, I think there was, in fact, a code of conduct. There was a cultural agreement that accounts for the fact that, you know, freestanding bank buildings were always Doric. And it had to do with associations, that if you built a bank and it was Doric, that there was a larger understanding that your money was safe, that this was a solid, permanent structure. You know, the same thing was true of building a church. You know, if it was a little church, it would be in one style. If it was a cathedral, it would be Gothic, or if it was a prominent cathedral, it might be in the Renaissance style. Likewise, I think as a 20th century building type, you know, the tall office building, I have absolutely no problem with it having a glass curtain wall. And I think that, you know, for me, we're residential architects. I think that there are a certain set of forms, as Robert was suggesting, that are just associated in not architects' minds necessarily, but in people's minds with domesticity. And that those are the things that have meaning for me in terms of the decisions I make about what the houses I build are going to look like. And you know, I mean, impermanent structures, you know, modern architecture is lightweight, and it's supposed to look like it could blow away, or more recently fly away or sail away. And you know, I'm fine with that for certain kinds of institutions. If you have a civic institution that needs to represent itself in a certain way to the public, and it's a building that needs to suggest that it will be there keeping you safe in our society 100 or 200 years from now, then it's very clear that perhaps, or clear to me that stylistically it should be built in a manner that suggests permanence.
Interestingly, we ran with the figures that have been in Britain to make consistent research into this, some of which I've commissioned, and it is about 85%, 15%. It's completely consistent. Other people research, it comes out with the same figures. Everyone then told me, oh, that's all right, that's okay for houses. It's not true for other buildings. People don't think that about other buildings. So we thought we'd test it. We commissioned YouGov, I think you're the same organization, to test this with 4 buildings. I mean, I won't go into details, no time, but they were very explicitly, they were built, they were the same height, all modifications were eliminated, and guess what came up with the same result, 85%, 15%.
Dictated how buildings in medieval Italian cities were built. And there are people now researching these. Arab cities in the medieval period, we have records of some of the urban codes of these cities going way back, which are extremely detailed. And so things that we tend to think of as being, you know, artisanal and made up on the spot, many of them were not at all. And then you get something like Seaside, which maybe has a certain kernel of urban code, but then what happens is the place takes on a life of its own. And this is what I was trying to explain when I was talking about some of the places like in Italy or where you have a piazza, which today, like Santissima Annunziata in Florence, where the foundling hospital of Brunelleschi is, you walk into that Piazza dei Re and you see matching arcades all the way around 3 sides of that square. Well, it took about 200 years for those arcades to appear. They weren't all designed or built at once. But nobody did that because somebody required them to. It wasn't, you know, dictated by Cosimo de' Medici. It was in a way that the people of Florence and whoever was building got the idea, you know, Brunelleschi had a good idea. Why don't we make more of that and enclose the square? There was an idea of civic responsibility where the place, like, as if it, to use kind of a Lucan allusion, if I may, it's like the place wanted to be that. And so it came into being in a kind of cultural response without somebody putting a gun to any architect's head. I think that's what I would love to see. I think a lot of people are doing that, including Tom and other people who've spoken today are doing that. I'd just like to see more of it.
We're out of time. I'm sorry to the members of the audience who had questions, but I think I probably get the last word. I'd like to say that I think that the speakers have done a remarkable job in words, in images, and by example of precedent, in delineating the various arguments. I hope that this dialogue will continue and that what we've heard today continues to inform how we all think about precedent, about cultural legacy, about visual language, and about what constitutes place. And I thank you all very much for coming, and let's give our speakers a warm applause.